Today I'm going to talk about all of the Frieda McFadden books I have ever read and give them a rating. I'm going to try to go through it chronologically for how I read it in real life. I have not read all her thriller books and I do want to get through all of them, but I'm just going to do the video again. First Frieda McFadden book I ever read was The Coworker, and I was really excited when I first read this book because it was my first thriller that I've read where it wasn't too spooky. The pacing was really good. I read this book in 2 days, which at the time that was like, I didn't read books that quickly, mainly because I had a job, which I'm trying to get another one. But anyway, at the time I had a job, so like I didn't read books that quickly, obviously, because I didn't have as much free time. I'm not gonna give what the books are about, or not gonna give any spoilers. I'll try to give like a loose synopsis. I feel like it's good to go into thrillers, kind of blind. So this one, basically her coworker goes missing and she tries to figure out what happened. And there are twists and turns, as they always are in Frieda McFadden books, but this is my first one that I read by her, so I was obviously more excited about it. And my old rating scale, because I read most of these books last year, I did it out of 10 and now I do my ratings out of 5. So I say if I had to convert it, I would maybe give it like a 4 out of 5. Next up we have Do Not Disturb. This one takes place in a motel. She was like on the run from the police, her car breaks down, and then she has to find refuge at a motel, and that's where things take a turn. I wrote in my notes that it had a lot of twists and turns, and you cannot trust any of the characters, which I actually liked, because usually when you read a book, you typically know the main person's point of view, like they're a good person, depending on the genre. And I liked how this book, you didn't know. Could you trust the main girl, Quinn? Could you trust Quinn? You didn't know. Out of 5, I think this one was probably like a 3.5, 3.75, but I'll say 3.5. Next, we had The Locked Door. This one, in my notes, I put that as very similar to her previous 2 books where there were detectives, because the most recent ones I had read were the last 2 that I talked about, and they would kind of have like this similar vibe to them. I believe her father might have been a serial killer, and so when crimes start to happen that are similar to what had happened back in his day, people started to suspect her. I think that's what this one's about. Don't hold me to it. Yes, I'm looking at the back of the book, but none of the words are processing in my head. This one I gave a little lower than the last book. It was a 7 out of 10, so I think, is that comparable, I don't know, to like a 3 out of 10, a 3.5? I think Frieda McFadden's books are very easy to get through. I recommend her books if you like thrillers that aren't the best written, but they keep you entertained and they're like very fast to get through. Like if you're in a reading slump or something, I would always recommend a Frieda McFadden book, because you could just fly through them so quickly. Next, I have The Inmate. She works in a maximum security prison and she makes a connection with the inmate, and then obviously, things go awry from there. This book, it was not as spooky. It really wasn't too thrillery. I mean, maybe like a minimum suspense, I would say. And that's coming from someone who does not like to be scared like at all. Recently, I have been more into thrillers, like whether that's books or movies. Like I'm been a little more into being on the edge of my seat, but typically I don't like that. And so this book, in my opinion, didn't really give thriller too much. It was still, good. There were still some prizes. I remember reading this and was kind of like, like I was a little let down, and I would say it was a little repetitive as well. Overall, probably 3 out of 5. Next up, we have the Housemaid series. I actually read this one, then this one, a different book, and then I finished this one. But I'm just going to talk about them all together as a trilogy. I think there is a novella, and I don't know. I could be misspeaking, but I think she is coming out with a 4th book. I don't know if I made that up or not. I'll talk about each of them individually, but all around as a series, I would recommend. I think I would recommend all the books I talked about thus far. First book, The Housemaid. This one was more spooky than The Inmate, and I wrote that in my notes that it was a little more spookalicious than the last book. The twist, to me, I was like, my jaw was on the floor at the time. I was very surprised when things took a turn. I was super excited to read book 2. And for stars, I think I would have given this one a 4. To me, this one was like action-packed. I think in series it's way easier for things to happen quicker in second books, because you already know, the plot, the characters, the storyline, so it's easier for things to happen quicker. So this one I felt was more action-packed, and it was entertaining. Am I saying anything? This one I didn't feel it was as spooky. I think that's because I knew like the characters more and their point of view more, and then I don't know, I just felt like this one was just more entertaining than the first one, but not as spooky. Then I read the third one, and this one was my least favorite of the series. This one took place like years later, I believe, and the lady who was a housemaid in these two books now is a house owner of herself. A house owner herself. I have been stumbling over my words so bad today. I've been trying to cut all of it out, but it's been a struggle. Anyway, this one was my least favorite out of the series. I'd give this probably a 3.5. All around, I would recommend the Housemaid series. It was entertaining, it was fun, and sometimes that's just what you need out of reading. Like, you don't need it to change your life, you just need it to be entertaining. Then we have my first big letdown by Frieda McFadden. I was so excited to read this book. I remember like wanting to read this so bad, and I finally got my hands on it, and I was like, okay, reading it right now. And I was let down. I felt like the outcome, I was not vibing with it at all. This is one by one. I think it's a group of friends who go on a trip, and then one by one they start going missing in the woods because their car breaks down. Yeah, when it came out who was the person, you know, killing off everybody, I was not impressed. I remember being so upset about it. If I'm being honest, this is one Frieda McFadden book I would not read. But on the plus side, it didn't take up too much of my time because it's literally 250 pages. So there was that. Rating, honestly, I give it a 1. I was so upset about this book. Next, I read Ward D, which I read on Kindle Unlimited. Do you want to buy the physical copy? Now I don't have it. So Ward D, I read that all in one sitting, which is very uncommon for me, or was. Still now, I don't really read books in one sitting that much. This one, to me, I was very interested. I was obviously, because I read it all in one sitting. I really enjoyed the twist. This book takes place in, I believe, a psychiatric ward. I don't have the book in front of me, so I was trying to go off of my terrible memory. But I believe she works in a psychiatric ward, and she has to work overnight. You know, people start getting murdered and things like that, and she's like locked in the mental facility overnight. She can't get out, obviously. So yeah, that happens, and I really enjoyed it. I really couldn't guess like who was doing it. I also try not to guess when I read thriller books like who is the bad guy, because it kind of ruins it for me. So I wasn't thinking too hard about it. I think I would give that one 4 out of 5. It was one of my favorite Frieda McFadden reads. Then we have The Perfect Son. I thoroughly enjoy this book. I'm not going to say again it was a quick read because all of her books are. This one, I felt like it had really great pacing to it, which is kind of another way of just saying it was a quick read. This one just barely hits over 300 pages. I wrote my notes that I liked Liam's character. Do I remember Liam? No, because again, it's been a little minute since I read this book, but the book is about Liam. It's called The Perfect Son, and Erica is the FMC, and she has a favorite child, which happens to be her son. And then there's a girl who goes missing at the school, and now she's trying to, you know, she's like, is my son a serial killer? We will find out. So I really enjoyed this. I gave it a 9 out of 10. So I think that was comparable to like a 4.5 out of 5. I think one of my favorite Frieda McFadden books based on my rating, because I don't really remember it. I don't know, I just read so many books and I kind of have bad memory. So maybe that's a positive thing, because I'll just like reread all the books I have on my bookshelf eventually. Then we have Never Lie, which is all the rest of the Frieda books I read this year. All the ones I just talked about I read last year. This I read in January, and it was better than I expected, because this was one of the Frieda books that I would see like when I would go to the bookstore, and I'm like, oh, I'll read it eventually, and I read all those other ones before it. So it was better than I expected, because I wasn't like in a rush to pick it up. The big twist I didn't see coming, which again doesn't necessarily mean you won't see it coming, because I just try not to look for those things. This is about newlyweds who buy a new house, and then they find tapes from a psychiatrist who used to live there who like vanished, and yeah, was good. I would give this a 4 out of 5. Then we have The Teacher. The Teacher was on the opposite end. I read this right after I read Never Lie, and this was one that I was like excited to read. I was not having it. I was not really vibing with this book at all. I felt like it dragged out too much. Like it was almost 400 pages, which doesn't necessarily mean the book drags out, but this one in particular did. The MMC and FMC were both pedos, so I wasn't really loving that. And the father got judged for being one, but then the mother didn't. That was actually a spoiler. Okay, so I'll put spoiler warnings before I talked about that, because that actually turns out to be a spoiler when you figure out who they're with. All around, I was not having it. I was overall disappointed. I felt like the twists were kind of like plot holes, because you know, sometimes with Frieda, or all the time, there's like twists in there, but sometimes they don't make sense, and I feel like in this book that was the case. I did not. 2.5. Still better than One by One, because One by One I was in my head, like I just thought that was gonna be so much better, whereas this one I didn't have as big of expectations, so I wasn't let down as much. Then I read The Boyfriend, which I talked about twice because I did a reading vlog, and then I read this book in February, so I also talked about it in that video. This book was middle of the road for me, and now having talked about all her other books, it wasn't my least favorite, but it wasn't the best. I gave it 3.5 or 3 out of 5. I don't really want to talk about this book again because I've talked about it twice and I'm over it. I was just about to try to explain this book, but I feel like, you know, it's just read the synopsis. She's looking for the perfect man, he's looking for the perfect victim. It says on the back of the book, 3.5, 3 out of 5. I keep saying 3.5, 3 out of 5. Then the last Frieda McFadden book that I read is The Crash. This book came out in March and I read it in March. I was excited to read it because it was a new Frieda book, and this one kind of fell similar to The Boyfriend, kind of middle of the ground for me. I gave this a 3.5 out of 5. The FMC is pregnant and she crashes her car and she ends up in this secluded cabin with the married couple who is, you know, going to help her, and then things take a turn. The FMC was pissing me off at times. I felt like she was kind of making stupid decisions in the circumstance that she was in, and I felt like the extra twist that happened at the end just wasn't necessary. Like, I want to spoil it so bad, but I'm not going to. The resolution for some of the characters was unrealistic, and there was extra twists that happened that if you read it, you probably know what I'm talking about. I felt like it wasn't necessary, and it pissed me off. So yeah, I give that a 3.5 out of 5. The last couple of Frieda McFadden books I have been reading have not been my favorite. I still want to make my way through all of her thrillers because there's only like 5 more that I haven't read, so I might as well. I used to love Frieda McFadden's books, and now I will still read them, but I used to love them more. I think I liked her older books a little better. That is it for all the Frieda McFadden books I have read, and off I go to not read more of her books right now. I'm actually not even gonna lie. I'm currently reading Leather and Lark, so I'm gonna try to finish this book today.